the webinar. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on our website. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now I'm going to turn over the introductions of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the webinar coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Kelly, thank you, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation. Thank you for joining us. If you are new to our webinar series, or perhaps you've attended before, I'm appealing to you to visit our website and make a donation that will allow us to continue this important programming. We have a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to get right to the introduction of our speaker, Sue Connors. Sue's presentation tonight is the second installment in a two-part series on educational issues. Last week she spoke about demystifying 504s and IEPs. You can find that webinar or any of her previous presentations on educational rights, denial of services, and dealing with TS in the classroom on our website. These and all of our webinars are available for free download and are chock full of really good information for our families and educators. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome has known Sue for many years. She's had a long career in education and advocacy, working with children and families living with Tourette. Sue, now a retired middle school teacher from upstate New York, has more than 33 years of classroom experience. She has traveled extensively all around the world, advocating, consulting, and presenting workshops on TS. She's won numerous local, state, and national awards for her work in the field. She's consulted with and made appearances on a number of TV programs featuring information on TS. She's published articles, brochures, videos, and book chapters on the education of children with TS, and recently published her first book entitled The Tourette Syndrome and OCD Checklist, a practical reference for parents and educators. When it comes to information and a discussion about Tourette, Sue knows what she's talking about because she has TS herself, as do other members of her family. Sue, welcome. We're delighted to have you back, and without further introduction, I'll turn tonight's presentation over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Depending on where you are, I hope you're keeping warm in this very cold weather we're having. This is a webinar near and close to my heart because I was a teacher. And, you know, as teachers, we want to know not just the problems, but now what do we do about it? And, you know, because Tourette is such a complex disorder, there is going to be an endless list of, you know, accommodations and techniques for working with children with this disorder because of the complexity of it. And I've given you many examples throughout the presentation, throughout my PowerPoint, which I'm not going to just read to you. I'll try to focus on some of the ones that took maybe a little bit more creativity to come up with, so you'll get the idea of, you know, how this whole thing works. But it's an interesting topic. I think, you know, to start out with, I have to say that accommodations, first of all, the intention of the accommodation is, as we know, to level the playing field for students with any kind of a disability. You know, it's the eyeglasses for the student who can't see, it's the hearing aid for the student who has a hearing problem, it's the, you know, wheelchair ramp for the child who can't walk, it's the preferential seating if you have a vision or hearing problem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And people say to me all the time, well, how do you know what to address, what accommodations are going to be appropriate? Well, the first thing I say is let's look at all of the academic, developmental, and functional needs of the child. There is a reason why the child is receiving services, whether it be through the 504 or IEP, and we have to look at what areas that child is struggling in, whether it be an academic area, a developmental area, or a functional, social, emotional area, and that's where we come up with our accommodations to meet the needs of that child. So it's just not all over the place. You know, I read in a book that a child with Tourette should have this accommodation. Well, if that particular child's not having that problem, they may not need that particular accommodation at that time. You know, how do you know that a child might need accommodations? And there are a lot of things, and, you know, I just named a few of them, probably the highlights. You know, obviously a decline in grades. If there's something happening in grades, they're suddenly dropping. If you're seeing a lot of increased frustration with a child, whether it be at school or at home, you know, frustration with them trying to stay in their seat, get their work accomplished. If you see suddenly decrease in a child's self-esteem, social difficulties within the classroom, a sudden negative attitude about school, school avoidance, school phobia, behavioral issues at school, which suddenly come out of seemingly nowhere, increase in Tourette syndrome symptoms because of the stress or the anxiety, and so many times we overlook, and I think it's equally important, difficulties at home that are a direct result of school issues. So if you're looking at some of these things, it's you know, that are happening to this child, you've got to stop and give it a second thought. This kid may need some accommodations or services. And now, I'm not going to go through the whole webinar that I did last week, obviously, but as most of you know, there are basically two options for services and or accommodations. We have, both of them are federal acts. One of them is, we've heard of, I'm sure, in many different settings, called the Americans with Disabilities Act. And there is a section of that act, actually Section 504, which provides educational accommodations in a school setting. And that's why that is now called the 504 Accommodation Plan. And it comes from Section 504, as I said, of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which basically prohibits discrimination based on a disability in programs or activities that receive any federal financial assistance. We also have a federal act called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, better known as the IDEA. I'm sure if you're not an educator, if you're a parent, you will know that we as educators have this horrendous tendency to talk in acronyms that we all understand and the rest of the world doesn't. So I tried each time to define what I'm talking about. The IDEA is the federal act which provides for an individualized education plan, or as we call it, an IEP, which provides not just accommodations but also direct services of some sort. It could be direct services of a special education teacher or another service provider, for example, an occupational therapist, speech-language therapist, counselor, etc. And those are the two acts that you can get, you know, services through. One, just accommodations; the other, accommodations plus direct services. Now, if you weren't able to listen to the webinar last week, I encourage you to go back to that one, which was entitled 504 versus an IEP, to kind of bring yourself up to speed on those two, so you kind of see the difference in which one may be more appropriate for a particular child. I think a couple things to remember, and as an educator, it was a fine line that I walked all the time. There is that fine line between accommodating and enabling. You know, we sometimes feel really sorry for these kids because they are struggling, and we want to make life easier for them, but we don't want to enable them. The accommodation is intended to, as I said before, level the playing field, to make it, you know, that they can accomplish whatever anybody else can, despite the fact that there's an interference because of a disability. But we don't want to just enable them and do everything for them. And obviously the other point is to somehow down the road, at some point in their life, to make them independent, to find the accommodations that work for them, just like, you know, the hearing aid for the hearing impaired child. The other thing is accommodations cannot in any way modify the curriculum itself. I have a lot of parents who will say, well, if my child can just do the first 5 chapters and everybody else does 10 chapters, then he'll be able to get through it. But that's really modifying the curriculum. You could modify an assignment and give them 10 math problems rather than 15 math problems, but you can't really modify the curriculum. That's not an appropriate accommodation. Now, when you're coming to Tourette syndrome, there are so many different areas. I wish I could say, you know, I've got a list of accommodations for tics. We end the webinar, that would be it. But unfortunately, Tourette syndrome, as we all know, is a spectrum disorder. And because of that, there are so many different complex levels of complexity to it. And so there are a lot of things that may have to be addressed by accommodations. Obviously, interfering tics, and we're going to talk about all of these, interfering obsessions or compulsions, because so many kids with Tourette have OCD, handwriting difficulties, whether it be dysgraphia, written expression deficits, attention problems, attention deficits, because a lot of our very large number of kids with Tourette also have ADD or ADHD. Short-term memory deficits, social skills issues, processing deficits, hyperactivity, behavioral issues, which so many times we're so judgmental about, and it could really be a child's behavior. Kid is acting out because they're really struggling without the accommodations they need. And the big one, as the kids get older, is the executive dysfunction, or the child's complete inability to keep organized, do their homework, lose it on the way to school, put it in a folder, they lose the folder, have the right book, the wrong folder when they get home, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just with Tourette, it's not just tics and obsessions. It's all kinds of areas because of the comorbidity. So you got to look at a lot of different things. Now, I think one of the problems that I encounter all the time, and I'm not saying this to be negative about teachers, but I'm saying it, I guess, to be negative about how we as teachers were educated. And I have a master's degree, as almost every teacher in this day and age does. And still, when I was studying to be a teacher, and in so many subsequent courses and seminars that I took, we never learned about this disorder. If I had known about Tourette, I would have known that I had it myself, and I didn't know until I was 36 years old. I'd had it for 30 years already. Because, teachers don't learn about this. It's not part of what we teach them, unfortunately. And if we do, it's such a tiny smattering of it that it's not enough. And teachers need to understand all the complexities of Tourette if they can, to help them effectively accommodate a child. It is essential that whether it's a 504 plan or an IEP that your child has, that it contain the accommodation that a mandatory in-service for all staff working with the child be done every year at the beginning of the school year for all the staff members working with that child. You can get that written right in the 504 plan or IEP, and it's such an important thing. Usually it's done by, I know for those of you from New Jersey, they have people from the New Jersey Center for Tourette that come out and do the in-service, depending on the state, whether they have an alliance or a Tourette chapter or whatever. You can get probably somebody from there to come out. There are also several videos that have been produced that are really good for going through and educating the staff, but it's such an important thing that everybody understand Tourette and all the complexities of it. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit, because Tourette is, as I said before, we all know that Tourette is a tic disorder. It's a neurological movement disorder, which is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. And so kids with Tourette will exhibit tics. And because so many people with Tourette also have obsessions, I'm kind of going to intertwine the two together. Tics and obsessions can very much interfere for the child's ability to concentrate, write, read, and I think one of the most important things can be a source of great frustration for the child. For example, myself, I have a head shaking tic that I've had for many years now, and every few seconds I've got to shake my head back and forth. And it really does. I guess if you didn't do it or didn't sit and watch me, constantly, which no teacher can do in a classroom, to sit and watch one child, you don't see how much that impairs my ability to stay focused on a test, to stay on the line when I'm reading. It causes headaches. So it's a tic that slows down the process of whatever the child is trying to do. Any facial tic, an eye blinking tic, could make it difficult to keep your place. And you have to think, gosh, that's obviously getting in the way. What can we do about that? I worked with a student a couple of years ago who had a wrist twisting tic, where he would just twist his wrist constantly, and he tended to try to hide it so that people wouldn't say anything to him. So when he did it, he put his hands underneath his desk. And I watched him take a test one day, and the test was about 20 minutes. And in the 20 minutes, I kept track on my little piece of paper. He got out of his chair 12 times in those 20 minutes to go pick up his pencil that had flown out of his hand as he twisted his wrist. And when everybody else's paper was collected, he'd only done 3 of about 20 questions on the test. And it wasn't because he didn't know the material. Sometimes it can cause social issues, kids who will tease and make fun of and imitate tics. Obsessions can slow things down. I worked with a girl recently who was stuck on counting words as she read. She could read 3 words at a time. At the end of those 3 words, she had to stop, and in her head she had to count to 3 5 times, and then she had to close the book and tap 3 times on the cover of the book. Then she had to open it up, read 3 more times, read the next 3 words, read them 3 more times, close the book, tap. I mean, it was just this constant ritual that she had to go through, and was starting to really do poorly and everything. And you look at these things. What can you do with a kid who's got a wrist twisting tic? Well, obviously he needs someone to scribe for him. If it's a younger child, they need someone to hold that pencil because they physically can't do it. They might need some technology to be able to have them, do. There's lots of word activated, software now that's available for all computers, and even for the tablets that we have now. With this particular girl, what we did to try to make reading not just easier for her, but possible. It wasn't even possible for her to read doing that, and we ended up getting books on tape for her. All of her English books that she was reading for English class, we got out of the library, put onto her iPod, and we found out, which I'm sure anybody who would check would find out, that her school had every textbook that she was using on a CD. So she was able to just listen to her books or chapters out of her science book, etc. So again, you've got to look at what the obsession is, or look at what the tic is, and use that to try to, be creative and think about the ways you can accommodate that. And so many times when you're racking your brain over how can we accommodate this, don't forget to ask the kids, because they are very creative in coming up with solutions of things they have to deal with. There's so many times they will say, well, why don't I just try it this way? And you're thinking, yep, that's a great idea. I didn't think about that. I think the other thing is that because Tourette is so complex, it's so important to see that tics are not always what people think they are. In order to get a diagnosis of Tourette, you have to have, all kinds of motor tics or motor movements. But most people think of a tic as just what we would call a simple motor tic, which is a tic that just involves one muscular group. Like your eyes blinking, your nose is twitching, or your leg may be moving, your shoulder may shrug, some simple movement. But unfortunately, many, many kids and adults will have complex motor tics that don't even, to the onlooker, look like tics at all. They can look like very deliberate behavior, very bizarre behavior. For example, hopping. A hopping tic, getting out of your chair and taking a hop and getting back in your chair again. Clapping, touching tics. You have to walk down the aisle and touch certain things. It looks like the kid is deliberately trying to annoy the other kids in the room, touching their things as they go down the aisle of the classroom. Sticking out their tongue, pinching, tearing things, repeating somebody else's actions, giving obscene gestures. They can be, I worked with kids who have twirling tics, who have hopping tics, just all kinds of very complex movements can be complex motor tics, just like simple movements can be simple motor tics. Also, you have to have at least one vocal tic, and very few people have just one, by the way. I mean, that's the criteria for diagnosis, but I wish that's all I'd ever had in my life. But again, the vocal tics can be simple things, which is what we would think of as a vocal tic, like a noise you make, over and over and over and over, or sniffing. My first vocal tic ever was sniffing. I sniffed through second grade, and I can remember how many times a day I was asked to get a Kleenex, blow my nose, go out and blow my nose, try blowing my nose again. It wasn't going to make any difference how many times I blew my nose. That was a tic. A screeching sound, an animal noise, a throat clearing, a whistling. Any little noise you make over and over again out of the realm of normalcy of what's going on around you is a simple vocal tic. But at some point in a person's life, it's not at all unusual to have a complex vocal tic where you will actually say something which is linguistically meaningful. I worked with a boy just last year who would yell out peanut butter. That was his vocal tic. He just had to say peanut butter. And the kids in the class were getting, so disturbed with it, even though if you put it into the realm of everything that's going on in the classroom, it wasn't a big deal. It was just weird. They kept saying, well, you stop yelling out peanut butter. We know you like peanut butter. I mean, it's not something that the average person does. Somebody might sneeze, somebody might cough, somebody might blow their nose, but who yells out peanut butter? And so, they're disruptive because people don't understand them. Speech atypicalities can affect kids' performance. Kids who will suddenly be talking, all of a sudden their voice goes up and then their voice goes down again, changing the intensity of your speech. I've worked with a lot of kids who will develop what sounds like a stuttering, but it's actually a tic. So the tics themselves are much more than just, just a little noise you make or an eye blinking. They can be very complex things. And as a teacher for so many years, I guarantee that you will never be able to see every tic that kid does. They camouflage them, they try to hide them, and you cannot stand in front of a class of 20 to 25 kids and watch one child. It's not possible. So you so many times miss what they're trying to hide, because they don't want you to see it. And therefore, because you don't see it, you don't realize how much it's interfering. And then, of course, we have the unusual vocal tics, the echolalia, where you have to constantly repeat somebody else's words, polylalia, where you have to repeat your own words, and the one that I know has almost become synonymous with Tourette, unfortunately, and that's something called coprolalia, which is the involuntary uttering of curse words or something socially inappropriate as a phrase or a sentence. And I think you need to know, it's at the bottom of the screen, it's so important to note that this particular symptom, even though when you think Tourette you think swearing, it's very uncommon. Only about 15 to 20% of people will try to ever get that symptom, and it's not necessary for a diagnosis. But the one thing I may add about this, and I just today had a case on a telephone conference about a child that this happened to. All of his vocal tics right now are in this category, unfortunately, and they're all appearing to be very directed toward a certain ethnic group or certain children who have certain characteristics. A kid who may see somebody of a certain ethnicity and yell an ethnic comment about them. Tourette is very suggestible, and this kid is being punished constantly for a tic that really, it can be a very random comment, but it doesn't have to be. It can be seem very purposeful and directed. I think another thing we have to remember is that there are certain environmental factors. Tourette, one of the criteria for diagnosis is the waxing and waning. And, there are several factors that environmentally worsen the symptoms. Stress and anxiety at the top of the list. Excitement, especially with elementary kids. There's a holiday coming up. It's, field day. It's their birthday. Grandma's visiting, whatever. Fatigue, illness. All kinds of environmental factors can suddenly worsen the syndrome. So you can see how creativity plays such a huge role, and also this has to be a very fluid changing document, because if they have a tic now and 3 weeks from now don't have it anymore because the tic has changed, you may not need that accommodation. You may need something else to accommodate what's happening at that time. The other thing is kids do have the ability for very limited amounts of time to suppress the symptoms. It's never something to encourage kids to do, because unfortunately the more you try to suppress them, the worse they get. And this is something that I'm constantly trying to come up with accommodations for. I say to kids, if you know it's going to make it worse, and you know that you're not going to be able to concentrate on anything but holding your tics, then why do you do it? Well, I already know the answer, because I've spent a lifetime doing it, because it's embarrassing. Because socially it's difficult. You're afraid someone's going to say something to you. And the longer you try to hold those tics in, the worse they get, and they can result in not just an explosion of Tourette symptoms, but also a behavior explosion. And when I compare it to if I were to ask you for the next 10 seconds not to blink your eyes. I mean, everybody could do that, but at the end of those 10 seconds, you got to know you're blinking very rapidly, because it's really hard to hold stop and eye blink of any kind. We have to blink our eyes. That's a human movement, natural human movement. The other thing is, if all the time you're trying not to blink your eyes, if I keep talking to you, all you're really thinking about is not blinking your eyes, so your concentration's going out the window. So, a couple of things that I suggest as accommodations for this, just across the board for all kids, because everybody does do this, is, the ability to take breaks. Something as simple as giving them a pass to take a break out of the classroom. And we're going to talk about some of these little ways of working with these kids. Now, let's look at obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions and compulsions, which are very common and sometimes hard to distinguish from the tics themselves. We're talking, things like need for symmetry and perfectionism, having to have everything, perfectly ordered on their desk, and their locker has to be perfect. Counting things, like I was talking about this girl earlier, over and over again. Checking things, making sure that everything is, got to go back and check and make sure your lunch is still in the locker and everything is where you put it this morning, and, over and over and again, constantly doubting or worrying about something. I worked with a child who every time he heard a siren, he was convinced that the paramedics were going to his house, or his house was on fire, and the teacher was having to go call the mom to make sure everything was all right. Again, it's part of the OCD thing. Germ obsessions, where kids, they have to be constantly washing their hands and washing things over and over again. Fear of contamination. Transitions are very difficult for kids with any kind of OCD. It makes it very difficult to stop something and move on quickly to something else. Ritualistic behavior. I think one of the ones that I have had to work on the most in my own life, and also with many kids, and fortunately since I have it, I can relate to it and know how to accommodate it. A lot of our kids have what I call an obsessive sense of justice. This is the kid who will argue with you, for 20 minutes after class because he thinks he cheated you cheated him out of a half a point on his test. It's not even a half a point. It's like he has this obsessive sense of justice. They'll argue to the day is over about the silliest little things because they don't feel that what happened was just, even if it's completely unimportant. So you can see the OCD, just so many different things. And again, managing all this in the classroom, OCD, you're looping, you're stuck on something. I've always called OCD ticks in my brain. My body ticks, you'll see my head jerking and my shoulders shrugging, but then my brain gets stuck. I'm stuck on something and I can't move on from it. You're driven, you're perfectionistic, you have the need to complete things in a certain way, you have difficulty moving from one activity to another, your mental brakes get stuck. And, it's so important to assess the nature of the obsession and then look at possible solutions, not only with other teachers, but also with the parents. And again, you can never be too creative. Like, I'll give you examples. And just some possible accommodations. And again, I'm not going to read all these to you, but just to give you, some things to think about. Many times these kids will need tests taken in a separate location with time limits waived. Time limits cause stress. Classrooms are very quiet when it's testing, and then when a child is in a room that's very quiet, their noises are going to be more obvious. And so they try so hard to hold it in, they won't function well on the test. Educating the other students who come into contact with the child. And again, you can't do this without parental permission, but I think it's so important to understand that kids will tease, make fun of, and actually fear what they don't understand. I have done educational peer in-services for years in schools, and I have never had a bad situation with any of them. It's very effective. I actually wrote a brochure, which I'm happy to share with you, called Educating Classmates About Tourette, and it's really talking about differences and working your way into Tourette. And it really does help deal with a lot of the social issues that we talked about earlier, providing a refuge where a student can go to calm down, release tics in a less embarrassing environment. It could be the school nurse's office, it could be the school psychologist's office. Avoid the principal's office because that's so often equated with bad behavior. The breaks out of the classroom are so important. And I know that people say, well, the class is only 40 minutes. 40 minutes is an incredibly long time for a child who has Tourette to sit. They do need a break in that section somewhere. And it could be, a trip down to the bathroom, the drinking fountain, give them a laminated pass that they can leave on their desk. Sometimes as kids get older, I'll give them a set of passes. Here are your 6 or 7 passes for the day. You just leave it on your desk. Once you've used it, you can't use that one again. And they learn to kind of self-moderate, to recognize when they need that break. Sometimes just preferential seating. I remember the first time I walked into a room with this girl that had the twirling tic, and everybody was complaining endlessly about how disruptive it was. And when I walked in, I realized why it was so disruptive. She was sitting in the center of the classroom. So every time this girl had to stand up and twirl, it was disruptive. But I kept thinking how embarrassing for this child that she's got to stand up and everybody's got to watch her do this. So just by moving their desk to the side of the room, not necessarily the back because of the attention problems, but somewhere in the room where the tic won't be as noticeable and as embarrassing. Sometimes tics that are socially inappropriate. I've worked with a lot of kids who have spitting tics, and we've tried brainstorming about, kids being allowed to chew gum or have a hard candy in their mouth, which stops the spitting. Trying to schedule their core academics toward the beginning of the day when possible, because tics do get worse when kids are tired. I have a couple of other things. If you're working with a child who has extreme, especially vocal tics, that are very, very loud and disruptive in the classroom, I have used a Skyping technique where I ask the teachers in the school to set up a Skype room for the child where they can go have a desk and chair, have a computer that has obviously Skype on it, which by the way is a free service, so schools love it. And when their tics start getting so difficult, then they can go into their Skype room and the teacher can turn on Skype in her classroom and they can still follow along with the lesson. I had a little girl at one time, and she's now in college, said to me, when my tics start getting really, really loud, I get so stressed because I know I don't have any options. My only option is to have them call my mom, and she comes and takes me home. And then I get stressed because I know I'm missing my classes for the rest of the day. And so she said that stress aggravates the tics. It's like a vicious cycle. And just by providing her with this room that she could go to when she felt she needed it, cut down on the stress, which therefore cut down on the tic. And, you know, we started it, and she was using it several times a day. And after about 2 or 3 months, if she was using it 3 times a week, we were lucky. It just really helped calm the anxieties because she knew she had another option. I also have, if anybody wants to contact me, and I'm going to give my email address at the end, something that we've been using with kids with very, very loud and severe vocal tics. It's called a stenomask, and it's something that actually is used for court stenographers to take dictation. And the company I've been working with has actually now marketed a stenomask just for kids with Tourette syndrome that they will sell you by itself at a discount price from the whole package of, you know, stenomask plus tape recorder plus cords the stenographer would use. It's basically a very small thing. You can carry it in the palm of your hand, and it's made out of foam rubber, and you can put it just over your mouth, and it completely camouflages, stifles the noise from the tic. And it's really worked well, and I know a lot of kids who just like to have it with them just in case. So there are other things, and again, these are unusual things, but there are things that, you know, I'm certainly glad to share with you. Communicating with the parents. I can't tell you, with every child that I work with, the use of technology, you're going to find is one of your most invaluable ways to accommodate tics, obsessions, and so many other of the associated disorders. We are so lucky that we have tablets and computers and readers and voice-activated software that can be so helpful and make a child much more independent, and that's our goal. And they can circumvent so many of these issues that we didn't have when I was growing up. Just to give you a couple of examples, we talked about the first one with the child counting the words and us getting books on tape. I worked with a kid just last year who had a very bad germ obsession, and he was constantly out of the classroom. Every few minutes he had to go out and he had to wash his hands. And not only were his hands becoming red and raw and chapped and bleeding, but he was missing a lot of class. So we just got him some antiseptic hand wipes to keep in his desk, or he could carry a little bottle of Purell. Didn't dry his hands as much. He didn't have to leave the classroom. I've worked with a lot of kids who will have the constantly writing and erasing and writing and erasing and writing and erasing. It doesn't look perfect to them. The minute I see that technology, it's all going to look perfect on a computer. Now, if it's an elementary child and they don't know, don't have the good computing skills, you know, they can use the voice activate. They can have someone scribe for them. It'll take them forever to get it done. You can tell them 100 times, stop erasing. They can't stop erasing. Anxiety often goes hand in hand with OCD, and it's something that you don't always see. I had a teacher a couple days ago tell me, I don't see the anxiety. Well, you can't always see it. The kid could be sitting there trying to hold it all together and just not feeling safe, not from anything you've done or said to them, but just because of this overall anxiety that goes along with the OCD. You know, creative scheduling, partial day instruction, changing the environment, distraction can sometimes break an obsession or decrease the anxiety. Finding someplace in the building somebody they excuse me, can go to help decrease that anxiety and can speak with them. And as I said before, so many of our kids have ADHD, and it's a huge issue because a lot of them aren't able to take the stimulant medication. Some can, that really help ADHD. And we all know that the characteristics of a child with ADHD are, you know, inattentive, impulsive, hyperactive, disorganized, and socially immature. That kind of sums up a child with ADHD. There it is right there. And all of those are going to interfere with what that kid is trying to get done in school. You know, again, ADHD kids, so many of them, I combine ADHD, which is the, you know, hyperactivity and everything else, with the executive dysfunction, because the executive dysfunction disorder is the disorganized part. And I so rarely meet kids who have ADHD who don't have this. And, you know, it's so interesting because it's the hardest thing, for me as an educator, it was the hardest thing to accept as a disability, and not just the kid being lazy, not caring, not trying, because that's what it looks like. You know, again, the preferential seating, quiet place in the classroom. I worked with a teacher a couple years ago, an elementary 4th grade teacher, and she had, in her classroom, she had probably about 4 or 5 kids with ADHD, and she had set up, she had purchased with her budget money 13 of these plastic study carrels. They just kind of fold up, and she leaves them on the floor over in the corner of her classroom. And whenever they have independent work, any kid that wants to can go over and take one of those and put it on their desk to kind of block off their own little space. And I said, do that many kids really need this? And she said, no. But the kids who do need it then don't feel isolated. They don't feel like they're the only ones that have got this around their desk. And she said a lot of kids love having that little space to themselves. So she just made it a part of her classroom. She also had a huge number, I don't even know how many now, but of headsets that they could go put on. Because, you know, so much of the ADHD is that distractibility. You know, I always used to joke that you can always tell these ADHD kids in your class because, you know, if somebody in the back room drops a pencil on the floor, your average child will glance over their shoulder to see what happened. The kid with ADHD is completely turned around in their seat and taken off task for 10 minutes because of the pencil, which you can hardly hear because there's a lot of auditory distractions. You know, again, the freedom of movements, of visual cues. The disorganization, I could go on forever. You know, I used to constantly with kids, you got a 3-page test, here's your first page. When you finish it, come and give me the page back again. Let me take it and move on to the next one. Breaking things down. For anyone out there in this audience tonight who is a teacher, how many of you who have ever made the mistake of giving a child with these particular disorders a long-range assignment or project to do and saying, you know, could you get this in 3 weeks? You'll never see it. 3 weeks is like, get this to me sometime before you die. You know, that's what it means to them because they don't have that ability, that executive functioning ability to break things down. Sometimes something as simple as, you know, reducing the length of homework assignments because it takes them so much longer to do it. Quality is important, not the quantity. An extra day on a homework assignment, an extra couple days on a project. You know, these are the kids who, you know, you have to come up with some sort of system whereby they keep track of their assignments. If they write it down, then you need to initial to make sure that it's written down correctly, that they haven't been distracted and copied it wrong from the board. Sometimes allowing them to leave class a little bit early to get to their lockers and pack up and organize their materials when the halls are quiet. I have one boy I've worked with for quite a few years now, and he has, you know, he lives and breathes by his iPad, and he has just become the most functional high school student, and he's got every aspect of Tourette. He uses his iPad. He did use his cell phone. Now he switched to the iPad to take pictures of assignments written on the board. So he's got them all on his iPad. So he doesn't have to worry about getting them copied correctly or forgetting to copy them. You know, he has set up an organizational thing on his, he has little alarm reminders on there. He's got, you know, he's downloaded all of the textbooks onto his iPad from his teacher's CD. He's got so many things, and he also has a lot of the handwriting issues, so he has used the free app on his iPad called Dragon Dictation. He just speaks to it, and it types what he says, and then the minute his homework is done, he immediately emails it to his teacher so it doesn't get lost somewhere between home and school. So, you know, just one small piece of technology can accommodate so many of these difficulties, and it makes the kids much more independent. When you're in second grade, you don't mind a scribe sitting next to you, but, you know, in high school, you do mind. You need to find ways that you can become independent, and technology is really the way to do it. You know, at home, you can help kids color code. You know, the textbook cover matches the color of the folder for that class. Keeping a large supply of pens and pencils for the teacher to lend students. I used to be so grateful when people would come in and donate a box of pencils to my classroom. You know, I used to also too worry about getting supplies back because I was forever lending things to these kids, and they would forget to bring them back again. And for years, I used to, if I lent them a pencil at the beginning of class, they had to give me something like hostage. And what I always took was one of their shoes, and I would make them put one of their shoes by my desk, and they didn't get their shoe back until they brought their pencil back. I have to tell you that I have seen kids with ADHD walk out without their shoe. I've seen it happen. Okay, but they usually don't get too far. But it's just, you know, just different ways. I think the whole idea is to look at it as this is the child's disability. He's not doing this on purpose. It's not his fault. And we're trying to give him strategies that he knows will work for him, that down the road will become part of his repertoire, how he lives. Don't assume that because a student is not sitting perfectly still and looking at you that they're not paying attention. Kids with ADHD need fidgeting. They need to be moving. It's an understimulated nervous system, and they stimulate it by being in motion. So if they're squeezing something or tapping something or, rocking. I was in a school last year that in the school library all the chairs were rocking chairs. I'm thinking, oh my God, I would have loved this school, because everybody got that. It wasn't, rocking so hard that they'd fall off their chairs, but just getting that movement that kept them on task. Doodling. How many of us doodled when they were in a boring lecture? Just all kinds of different things. As I said, I'm not going to read through every one of these, but just, the daily communication between home and school. A homework buddy really helps. Somebody they can call. And, every school now has teacher websites where you can go on and you can find the child's homework. Technology has made life so much easier for these kids. Make sure that the kid has, the 3-ring binder, trapper keeper type things where all the folders are kept together. Organize it by the class schedule, and make sure you keep a zippered pouch in there with extra supplies just in case. When I work with a child and they're getting any kind of services, resource room or consultant teacher, I make sure that one of the things that teacher does with that child once a week is do a folder and a locker clean out, because otherwise it just piles up and piles up. That's their disability, the organization. Emailing the assignments into teachers. I've gone through a lot of these already. One of the biggest issues that a lot of our kids deal with is the dysgraphia, the handwriting issues. It's a nonverbal learning disability, and it has a lot of characteristics. Slow and laborious writing, that hand and finger cramping, which makes it really hard to get more than 2 or 3 words at a time without your hand just really hurting. It results in sloppy, messy handwriting, uneven spacing, irregular margins, letters all over the place. They copy things wrong. They have visual motor component. They'll copy the math assignment from the board, and it may say page 10, 1 through 20. They'll copy page 21 through 10. Thus, taking a picture of it solves the problem. Difficulty with their written expression, getting their thoughts on paper, punctuation, capitalization, interfering tics and obsessions and OCD issues that can get in the way with the writing process. All of these kids need notes provided, or a chance to take a picture of the notes on the board. Again, you could look at this entire list of problems. I have every single one of them on this page, and I have circumvented it all as an adult, not as a child, by having having an iPad and by having a laptop computer. I don't have to worry about this anymore because everything is done on the computer. So you don't, and that's their life. That's what it's going to be. Obviously you want to have the child evaluated first by an occupational therapist. When they're younger, the scribe. As they get older, the computer. OT services will work to a certain point, but after a while they're just not going to be effective because their muscles aren't elastic enough. And again, the computer software, voice-activated software, there's so much stuff out there that's so useful. Tests being given orally, waiving time limits. A lot of kids will have a real hard time with any kind of standardized test where they have to transfer the answer from the test booklet to the computer sheet, and they have to bubble it in. They may have A circled in their test booklet, but they'll bubble B on their test sheet. So, let them do it in the test booklet. Get somebody else to transfer it later. Graph paper that you can turn sideways to help line up math problems. And on and on and on and on we go. And again, just using that computer. A lot of our kids have short-term memory deficits. These are the kids who by 5th grade, if they are not passing their math facts test, they may know the math concept, but they'll just never be able to memorize those math facts. Calculator, it's got to go there. You'll give them a fill-in-the-blank test, they'll fail it, but if you put a word bank, they'll ace it because they can pick the word out. They know what the answer is, but they can't retrieve it, that short-term memory. Testing in small chunks, using flashcards. There's so many different strategies. The behavioral issues, I wish I had hours to focus on. They're most often, if you have a child who's experiencing any kind of behavior issues, if they are diagnosed with this spectrum of disorders, it's most often, the behavior is most often the result of one or more of the neurological issues. The OCD, they get stuck, they get frustrated. The anxiety, they're just in a panic mode all day long. Interfering tics and obsessions that just get in the way of what they're trying to accomplish. A lot of our kids have sensory issues, and they get on sensory overload. And so you'll find in a school setting, you're always in trouble in places of sensory overload. Whether it's the cafeteria, the hallway between classes, the school bus, wherever, the playground, wherever there's a lot of noise, a lot of bumping into people, smells. It's critical that we identify the trigger for the behavior before the problem can be solved and the behavior eradicated. Some of you may know Ross Green, Dr. Ross Green from Boston. He always says it's your explanation of a behavior that leads directly to how you respond to it. And our explanation is not always on task. I tell the story of a girl I worked with a few years ago in Wisconsin, and she had a tic where she actually, every time she saw the school principal, she had to scream out, "Kill the principal!" She only said it when she saw the principal. And, you know, if you walked into that building and you didn't know anything about this child and you met her and she yelled that out, I mean, what would your explanation be? Oh, my God, what a rotten little kid. What kind of parents must she have? Horrible. Why isn't she being suspended? That's your explanation. But once you find out that this girl has Tourette and she can't help saying that, you know, your whole demeanor about that child changes. All of a sudden you go from, you know, what a rotten kid with horrible parents to, oh my gosh, imagine having to go all day and every time you see the principal you have to say that. How horrible for that poor child. So, you know, it's important to figure out what the explanation is for the behavior and not respond to it until we figure it out. And the good thing is that the IDEA was reauthorized in 2004, and it has now made the conducting of a positive functional behavioral assessment and putting together a behavior intervention plan that it must be done whenever the behavior of a student interferes with the ability of that student or other students to learn. They have to do a behavior assessment to figure out why the behaviors. It's no longer just you may, you must do it. And you know, it's a process of figuring out why an individual is engaging in challenging behavior and how that relates to the environment. A lot of schools have their own assessment, but if you can get them to at least use in some way the functional behavioral assessment workbook that I actually co-authored through TSA, it nails it every time. It's a very simple, easy tool to use and does really help you identify what the problem is and put things in place. You know, and once you figure, like if you figure out this is a sensory issue that's causing behavior problems, then we got to get this kid out of the hallway. You know, we've got to get him leaving class a few minutes early with a friend to avoid that. Maybe we've got to look at a place where they go have lunch with 2 or 3 friends and not in that crowded, smelly, noisy, hot cafeteria which sends them to oblivion. You know, there's so many things, but if we don't identify what the trigger is, we're not going to be able to help them learn how to avoid those triggers in life. Counseling sometimes can help them verbalize their feelings, providing the refuge, avoiding the power struggles. You know, whenever the child is exhibiting difficult behavior, ask yourself if any of the following is true. Is the task beyond the student's capabilities? Does the child understand the directions? Does he require support with writing? Is the environment overwhelming to them? You know, the behavior may not be just a bratty kid. It could be any number of things that we have to figure out before we start looking at the kid as just a brat. You know, I've always loved this quote, we must see the child as in trouble and not the cause of trouble, from the CHAD manual. And so many times we do just the opposite. I don't have a ton of time to talk about. We talked a little bit about the sensory processing deficits so many times create difficulty in a school setting through behaviors. These are the kids who have a constant bombardment of sensory input that they're not perceiving or interpreting correctly. These are the kids who will have self-abusive behaviors, pick at their skin, touch surfaces that are soothing to them, crave rocking. They won't be able to stand the feel of certain fabrics. They can't wear shirts with tags. Bright fluorescent lights bother them. They can have any number of these sensory issues that almost always are oversensitive to certain smells, to certain sounds, etc. And they can affect any of the senses and cause great anxiety for the child and almost always result in some sort of a meltdown. So once you can figure out what it is that the environment is, how that's overwhelming them, you can solve the problem. You know, looking for obviously a sensory evaluation by the occupational therapist, letting the occupational therapist come up with some therapy techniques, looking at environmental modifications, which we already talked about. Again, the social skills issues. Not all of our kids are going to have full-blown autistic spectrum, but a lot of our kids will have difficulty. They're socially immature. They're developmental delays. They have difficulty interacting with their peers, understanding social rules. establishing eye contact, which can cause all kinds of issues, social issues in the classroom. You know, social anxiety, they demonstrate lack of judgment, prefer activities they can do alone. You know, they can explain what they need to do, but they can't always demonstrate it. And they just want to have friends. They don't know how. Again, we've got, you know, social skills training groups, social skills training, use of social stories. A lot of times in a school setting, it's the speech language person who really is trained to do that because they work with kids with social deficits and pragmatic language deficits, etc. You know, if I could kind of end this, because we're getting a little short of time and I want to leave some question time, you know, the couple of the last thoughts, it's so easy to look at these kids and see the disorder but not the child. You know, so many times we look at the kid who's yelling something out that seems so inappropriate, and it's hard to know that there's some really neat kid behind all this who may be very bright, very caring, very sweet, very talented. You know, we miss some incredible kids if we just see tics, obsessions, and, you know, behaviors that are results from some of their, you know, comorbid conditions. It's just so critical. I never wanted to be the kid who ticked. You know, I have tried. It's not who I am. Keeping a sense of humor is enormous, not only for educators but for parents. It's saved me in, you know, a million times in my life to be able to, you know, as much as I'm crying on the inside, if I can put on that brave, you know, smile and try to laugh a little bit on the outside, it does really help tremendously. And, you know, children don't die from Tourette syndrome, but I see on a daily basis with the work that I do that their spirit dies every single day as they try to maneuver in a world that just doesn't understand them and all the complexities of their disorder. I put this slide in there because, you know, so many people ask me, how did I get to where I am, you know, educator for 33 years. This right here is the reason why. And I grew up in rural Adirondack Mountains in northern New York. No centralized schools when I was there. This was my elementary school for 6 years. I had the best early education that, you know, for 6 years that any child could have. There were 4 kids in my class. There were 17 kids in the whole building. And, you know, because of that, my teacher, I mean, she was phenomenal. There was no resource room. There was no special education. That didn't exist back then. But because I was in this situation with this wonderful, caring teacher who saw the movements, she heard the noises, she looked at the hyperactivity, and she taught us with her heart. She made accommodations. You know, she looked at what our strengths were, and she focused on those and didn't focus on the fact that I was constantly blinking my eyes. I didn't know why I was doing it. And, you know, this is really the reason, and if all schools could be like this, we would not have 3/4 of the problems we have with a lot of our kids in schools now. I wish everybody could have had that early education that I have. And I think one of the funniest parts of that is in that school there were 17 kids. Of them, 6 of them were myself and my 5 sisters and brothers, and every one of us had Tourette. So when 38% of your elementary school has Tourette, I guess you're going to make it. You didn't fit in if you didn't have it. Some resources. There's a whole list of resources. The catalog of accommodations that I think I mentioned earlier. If not, functional behavioral assessment workbook, writing an IEP for parents, for teachers. There's my email address that by all means I can provide you with any of these as an attachment to an email. Shoot me a quick email and I'll be glad to send any of these on to you so that you can use some of these, because I mean I've hit the tip of the iceberg tonight. There's just so much more, and it's just that creativity. That's my book. It's this webinar plus. I mean, it's a very practical reference. There are chapters of accommodations and anecdotes on, you know, what we've had to come through to get to the point of that accommodation. Once again, there's my contact information, connors@roadrunner.com. Shoot me a quick email. I'm glad to provide you with any of these resources and other things that you may want, answer, you know, simple questions, brainstorm with you a little bit, whatever. And because I've had so much experience with this, I've probably met a child with a problem you're having right now and have already come up with some sort of a creative accommodation that works for it. So by all means, contact me. We have a little bit of time left for questions if anyone has anything they would like to ask.
Is that a rhetorical question? Because I think we're ready to start.
Okay.
I think before we do, I need you to maybe get a sip of water and turn down your speakers.
Turn down the speakers. Okay, hold on.
All right, and I'll try and, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Is that a little bit better?
That's a little better. Yeah, not so much echo.
Okay, good.
All right, so this attendee loves the idea of the Skype room, but wonder if a person has to staff it. And what was your experience in the situation you spoke of?
That's a good question. The kids that I've used it with mostly have been older, middle or high school kids, and they weren't kids that were any kind of behavior issues, so we didn't staff it. But in a couple of instances we have, because the kids have been a little bit younger, and we just used we made sure that, not that that child had a one-on-one aide in the classroom, but that that classroom had an aide, so that when the child had to leave, and it was their choice to leave and go to the Skype room, then that aide just automatically went with them. So we set it up so there was a classroom aide at that time. And no school that I've tried this with have had a problem with it, because they saw that how difficult it was to try to keep that child in the classroom. So they were not at all unwilling to do this.
Would the Skype room accommodate more than one person?
I think it would be hard, only because, if you've got a couple of kids in there with really loud vocal tics, it could make it distracting for the child. But, most schools have a couple of spaces. The one we used for the girl last year was it sounds terrible, it was a storage room, but it was a real big storage room that had shelves and, and it didn't have windows in it, but she was very comfortable in there. She could tick away and just turn the volume down on her Skype so she could hear the classroom. And if they wanted to call on her, they would call on her. She'd turn her volume up and contribute. And, we found that after a while she just didn't use it all that much, because it just reduced the anxiety of, what do I do if my tics are getting so bad that I can't stay in the classroom?
Yeah.
She didn't have to worry about it.
That's a great idea. Question about the FBA workbook. Could you say again where someone would find that?
Yes, you can get it through the National Tourette Association, but if you just email me, I will send it as an attachment, since I'm one of the authors of it. And I think it's something that very easily, I'd be more than happy to send to you.
Okay.
I'm sorry, my other phone is ringing. I'm ignoring it. Go ahead.
Okay. What kind of accommodations or modifications would you recommend for a student who has an aversion to fire drills?
That's a tough one, and you first have to figure out what it is. Is it a matter of them having a phobia of fire? I just worked with a child just about 2 months ago who had that, and what they were doing is they were thinking that it was a phobia of fire, so they were preparing her and letting her know, okay, we're going to have a fire drill at 10 minutes after 10, so just so you know, it's just a fire drill, everybody, it's not a real thing. And she was still having the meltdowns, and what it turned out to be, it was a sensory thing. It was the shrill of the fire drill. So what they had to start doing is removing her from the building before the alarm went off.
Well, in this particular case, it says that the student currently leaves the building, but this mom is concerned about an actual drill, and also not sure the escape is the proper answer. It's just that whole stress.
So what they do now is they remove her from the building before the fire drill takes place?
Apparently, yes.
Yeah. With all kids, every now and then you're going to have something that's going to trigger a fire alarm. The cook in the kitchen sets something,
Yeah. And in this case,
smoky or whatever.
Yeah. In this case, too, it's not even just the alarm, it's the word. So seems to just fire is apparently a real trigger for this child.
See, that could be more of an anxiety OCD kind of issue.
Yeah.
And sometimes if you just, with this, I've worked with some kids where we just notify them in advance and know that a fire drill is coming. It's not the real thing. But, it's going to happen that you're going to be somewhere where a fire, alarm will go off, and it could be a malfunction, but you won't know that. So I think, 90% of the time you can kind of, resolve the situation by either removing them, getting them out of the situation entirely, warning them that it's a drill, but there are going to be times when it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But at least 90% of the time you can resolve the issue.
Okay. What is the psychological cause of TS? That's not really the question specifically, but if it's something that a parent struggled with and it's undiagnosed, what would be the best way to approach a parent with your concerns as an educator?
I'm not sure I understand the question. A parent
Okay.
is struggling with the same issues?
No, the parent it's undiagnosed, it would seem. And how does the teacher approach the parent with their observations, and they're seeing this difficulty with the child in the classroom?
Got it, got it.
And it would seem there's probably maybe some issues on the parent side as well.
Yeah, that happens a lot, and it is a difficult, thing to do. What I always recommend is to, even using something like tonight, I attended this webinar, and I learned, I as I was listening to this, I kept thinking of, Johnny, and wondering if you've ever noticed any of this at home, just to try to broach the subject that way. Another way to kind of make it a little bit easier is to almost, try to find get the school nurse to meet with you with that person, because it's a medical issue, and sometimes coming from a medical person, the parent can kind of take it a little bit better. It's more like, I'm not a doctor, and I certainly am not going to say this is what it is, but when I started listening to this, I thinking, wow, he does this and he does that, and have you noticed it at home? And just let the parent kind of take it from there. And you're going to know right away if the parent goes, yeah, no, never see anything like that at home at all, that obviously they're just not accepting of it. But if the parent says, yeah, they may be out there looking for an answer themselves and just have not come across a doctor who knows what Tourette is or enough about it to be able to diagnose it. But I think just broaching it, like I've just learning about this. I just got some information from a webinar, and I started right away thinking about a couple of kids, and Johnny was one of them. And what do you think? Have you seen him do any of these things at home? And I, blah blah blah. Sometimes just approaching it in a very gentle way like that, and having some information to let the parents take home with them. Just printing out something, a brochure or whatever, can just give them something. And they may not, be ready at that moment to jump in and say, oh, yeah, but hopefully, giving them time to digest it, they may.
I know I've suggested to teachers sometimes that they try and have the parent call us, in the case of a New Jersey
Yes.
parent, or their local chapter, wherever they are,
Yep.
and try and get somebody who kind of knows a little bit more about it and maybe can answer questions a little bit
Yeah,
better
that's a
than
great
they
idea.
know.
That's
Yeah.
a great idea. Yeah, and you're right. Just so that if they have questions, that's why, if you can give them a brochure from the New Jersey Center or a local support group, and if they call them up, then it's like a parent talking to a parent rather than the worst thing you can do is kind of bring every teacher in there and overwhelm them. It's just, this is a little discussion. I've been noticing this. I never really thought about this until I got this information through a webinar, and I'm just thinking, have you noticed this?
Yeah.
I've got a pamphlet you might like to read, and here's some people you could call, and by all means, call us back and contact us, and let's talk about it. And we'll see if we can help you with a doctor referral or whatever. Because it's overwhelming when the parent first finds out.
Yes. Yeah, it is. So this question relates to this child who's 11. My son erases, rewrites when he keyboards. So could you talk a little bit about the voice-activated software, and how complicated is it, and what's the deal?
It's not very complicated at all. There are a couple of different ones out there. The ones that I'm most familiar with, there's one called Dragon, and that's the dragon, the animal, D-R-A-G-O-N. Dragon Speak Naturally, and that is a CD that you download on just about any computer, and you have to train the voice to it. But I am finding that I'm not touting any product over another, but the one that seems to be the easiest to train your voice to and the easiest to use is the one that comes with Apple products. The iPods have it, the iPads have it, I think even some iPhones may have it, and it's called Dragon Dictation. And it's, what I love about it is it's free. It's a free app, and you just download it onto the iPod or the iPad. And so many schools now have a stockpile of iPods and iPads that kids can use at school. They can just download that app, and if they have one of their own at home, and it's very effective. It's very portable, and the kids love it. And for a situation like that, I've worked with kids who will type 3 words, delete 2, type 3 more, delete 2. It's the same erasing thing, only they're doing it on the computer, and the only way to circumvent that is not to be typing.
Okay. So I have a question about short-term memory. The child seems to learn well, stores short-term info well, but there are retrieval issues at times. Is that common, uncommon? Talk
I think
a
it's
little
fairly
bit more.
common. It's fairly common. That's why I so many times recommend, if you're seeing any problems with the short-term memory, retrieval, sometimes it's just a matter of giving the child the word bank to pick from rather than having them retrieve the information. I was given a test one time as part of a Tourette study, and I can relate to this so well because the doctor had a stopwatch in his hand. He looked at me and he said, when I say go, you have 15 seconds and you have to name as many words you can think of that begin with J, but they can't be proper names. And he went, okay, go. And I'm looking at the stopwatch ticking away, and I'm going, John, Joseph. I couldn't think of one word that began with J that wasn't a proper name. I was an absolute wreck, sweating. And that's a real extreme situation, but that's how these kids are. It's like trying to retrieve that word. If you see it written amongst a bunch of other words, there it is. And that can be a definite disability that kids have. And again, there are ways to circumvent that, just the way, you test the kids. I used to make up 2 sets of tests for every test I gave, depending, because the kids that had special needs, they may need a word bank. They may need something a little bit different than what the other kid needs. Nobody ever knew that everybody had a different version of the test.
That's actually leading me to another question, too. Talk about, what is that word bank? Is that like a vocabulary of everything okay.
Like, say, for example, it's a social studies test, and you have to fill in the blanks with a word to, complete whether it's geography or whatever related to social studies. And at the bottom of the page, you would have all the answers and maybe a few other ones thrown in. It doesn't have to be just the ones that you need for those 20 questions, and they have to go and find the answer in the word bank. And they'll find it right away as they look through, but if you ask them to retrieve that word on their own, they just won't be able to do it.
Okay.
It's a word retrieval short-term memory problem.
Question going back about the dragon speak. Is the parent responsible for teaching the child, or is this something that's done at school?
That's something that should be done at school. As a matter of fact, a parent can ask for, and that's something I recommend of every parent whose kids are having issues that may require technology, ask the school to do what's called an assistive technology evaluation. It's not an actual evaluation of your child. It's looking at what issues they have. Are they having interfering tics and obsessions, which are creating a problem with writing? Are they disorganized and having a lot of executive dysfunction problems? Have they got handwriting issues? And what the assistive technology person will do is look at what technology is out there that can help circumvent that disability for that child. And they have I can't keep up with technology. I just went the other day, because I do, all my things are Mac, and went through the list of educational apps that are free from Apple. They've got one for everything. There's something that can circumvent anything. But they come up with them so quickly that you have to have an assistive tech person. And sometimes it's done, the school system will contract out with the local university. Sometimes they go through a local educational agency. Depends on, what the school system does. But they look at what technology is available, and then the school has to figure out a way to get that technology in place and, set it up for the child and train the child, definitely.
Okay.
That's
All
part
right.
of the evaluation process.
We're about out of time. I think I'm going to just end with one more question.
Sure.
At my son's school, we got an accommodation for separate testing place. Unfortunately, it's not working out. It's too public. It's in an open area, and he's very distracted. How does, so what does the parent do? Go back and say, you need to change this because it's not working? How do you deal with the school about that?
Yeah, just say it's not working. So many times a separate location is because of distractibility. So you're putting him, in the school library. He may be in a separate location, but it's more distracting than sitting in the regular classroom. If it's a child who has separate location because of tics, vocal tics, that they're, don't want to disturb other kids with, they don't want to, be distractions, then you almost need to put on this plan, their 504 or IEP, that it has to be a completely separate location. a location by themselves in a room, whether it be the guidance conference room or wherever, so that they have privacy and they can get up and, you can ask the kids wear a headset while they're taking a test to cut out the distractions, even if it has music on it. If it should never be a wide open space for any. I can't think of a reason you would take a kid out of a regular classroom and give them a separate location and put them, out somewhere where there's more distractions than in a regular classroom. That doesn't make sense. I think you have to go back, just ask, you can now change the IEP without, conducting a whole new huge IEP meeting. You can just go back and everybody can agree this isn't working, let's make this small change to it. And they can find a place for that person, depending on what the reason is. That if it's for distractibility, then we have to find a place where there are only maybe 2 or 3 or 4 kids. He gets to sit off on the side and put a headset on. Let's take care of all these distractions around them. If it's because of vocal tics, then you need to find a completely separate location where they're not going to be worried about distracting other kids with their vocal tics.
Okay. All right. Sue, I think we need to wrap it up here, so I'm going to sign off. Thank you. I know Kelly has a few remarks, but thank you. A lot of great information.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining our webinar on accommodations and techniques for working with students with Tourette Syndrome and associated disorders. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The discussion board is open now and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for additional questions that you might not have asked during the webinar. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archive recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to the site shortly. Our presentation on phobias, our next presentation is on phobias and will be presented by Dr. Martin Franklin, and it will be scheduled for February 12th, 2014. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Sue, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for attending. Good night.